The srubnaya culture, also known as the timber grave culture, emerged during the Late Bronze Age, which is approximately 19 to 12 centuries before the Common Era, across the Pontic-Caspian steppe, primarily in what is now southern Russia, Ukraine, and parts of Kazakhstan. This culture is considered a successor to earlier steppe cultures, like the Yamnaya and Catacomb cultures, representing a continuation of the Indo-European presence in the region. The name srubnaya is a Russian word that derives from the distinctive practice of constructing log-lined timber graves, or sruby, which were dug into the ground and covered with wooden beams before being buried under earth mounds or kurgans. The srubnaya people were primarily pastoralists, with a strong emphasis on cattle, sheep, and horse herding. Their nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle was shaped by the expansive grassy steppe environment, which provided the ideal conditions for grazing livestock. Although they were mostly pastoral, they also practiced some agriculture, growing cereals such as wheat and barley. They lived in small dispersed settlements that often consisted of pit houses or structures partially dug into the ground for insulation. The srubnaya culture was notable for its mobility, and horses played a key role in their way of life, used both for transport and in warfare, which was likely an essential part of their society, as they defended their territories and expanded them. In terms of burial customs, the srubnaya people continued the steppe tradition of burying the deceased in kurgans, with the wooden timber lining being a characteristic feature. Graves typically consisted of single or multiple burials, and individuals were interred in a crouched position, often on their back or side. The graves included personal items like pottery, tools, or sometimes weapons, suggesting a belief in an afterlife where these items would be useful. For this video, I gathered the raw genomes of 16 academic srubnaya samples and used my trait predictor tool for DNA analysis to analyze them, predicting their appearance, health predispositions, and traits. Let's begin. Every male carried Y lineage R1AZ645. The most common predicted phenotypes were Mediterranean, Nordic, and Alpinid, but others were also present, such as Indo-Nordic, Stranded, and Volgid. Here is the average phenotype morph of all the predicted phenotypes in the group. The most common predicted eye color was brown and hazel, but lighter eye colors were also present. Interestingly, no sample scored a dark brown eye color. The most common hair color was dark brown, with a couple samples scoring dark blonde, light brown, and black. No sample was predicted to be red-haired. The most common skin colors were olive and white, but one sample also scored light brown skin as its predicted skin color. The most common predicted hair texture was wavy, but a couple samples also scored curly, straight, and kinky hair textures. Surprisingly, every sample except one scored a Greek-shaped nose. The srubnaya as a group seemed to have a strong predisposition to a Greek nose shape. Regarding predicted height, taller stature was equally as common as shorter stature. The samples were slightly predisposed to warrior phenotype based on combed MAOA and MAOB genotypes, with 5 samples being predicted to be warriors and only 3 being predicted to be warriors. This leads to higher dopamine levels and worse stress tolerance. The samples had average predisposition to D2 receptor availability, and this leads to average predisposition to such conditions as schizophrenia and bipolar. However, the samples seem to have a slightly increased predisposition to bipolar 1, which is likely caused by effects of other genes that are not DRD2. The samples had an average predisposition to autism, and 4 of them were predicted to be lactase persistent. The samples had a predisposition to a lower level of empathy based on OXTR genotypes. The samples had a strong predisposition to lower odds of cardiovascular issues. 1 sample scored higher levels of homocysteine and 1 sample scored lower levels of homocysteine, with the rest scoring average levels of homocysteine. The samples had a below average predisposition to alcohol dependence. The samples had an average predisposition to epithelial cancers based on 8q24 genotypes. The samples had some protection from autoimmune disease based on their HLA genotypes. They had low predisposition to type 1 diabetes, especially compared to what we are used to seeing Europeans score. They had low predisposition to multiple sclerosis, Also, although 5 people did carry HLA-DRB1 variants for multiple sclerosis risk, they had an average predisposition to atrial fibrillation, they had a high predisposition to primary biliary cirrhosis, they had an average predisposition to PCOS, 5 out of 16 carried risk variants for hemoglobin E disease, which is a rate comparable to what we have observed with other European samples. Regarding athleticism and the ACTN3 gene, the sprinter allele was a lot more common among the srubnaya samples than the endurance or unathletic allele. 2 out of the 16 srubnaya samples were predisposed to higher odds of obesity, and 3 out of 16 were predisposed to lower odds of obesity. They had roughly average risk of syncope. Regarding vitamin D and LDL cholesterol, we see a trend that is perhaps familiar to Europeans. The samples were predisposed to a higher level of vitamin D, but also higher levels of bad LDL cholesterol. Glucose levels were roughly average, and none of the samples had iron levels we could classify as dangerously high or the risk for hemochromatosis. Most samples had lower red blood cell count. Telomere length was roughly average among the samples researched. The most common blood types were type A and type O, but type B was also pretty common. No sample was predicted to belong to blood group AB. Thank you for watching until the end. Links to all relevant data, including research data and data needed to replicate this research, will be in the description of the video. Thanks for watching, goodbye.